Stream is started. Who's the presiding judge?
I will be.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to make you the host real quick.
Oh wait, excuse me. I do believe. However, do you know what team we're from based on that conversation?
Stream is.
Yes, I think I know where both teams are from competing against both of you all. But again, will not affect my judging. Again, if you believe that it is, let the tournament. I will conflict out. But again, no, or yes. Sorry to answer your question. I will be as non-biased as I can, I promise. But again, I'm going to leave this up to you all.
Do you guys want Chris to stay, or do you want me to text Elliot saying that there's a conflict in the room?
Yeah, I think let's just. I think we can just say it's conflict.
Okay, so I'll text Elliot real quick. This is Courtroom 7, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so I'll be back so I can go ahead and go check the other rooms, but don't start yet until I come back and until the conflict is fixed.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right. I heard there was a potential conflict issue in this round.
Yes. I believe both sides had their own version of knowing the judge.
So in what way? Like you competed against him previous years, or he's judged you in this competition before?
It's not really us. We'll let the defense speak.
Your Honor, we just he knows what teams are from based on competing against some of our members and being friends with graduates and being friends with some people in the room. We just want it to be safe since he knows the identity of the teams.
I mean, so I know Chris personally, and I can assure you that he probably knows every team competing here because he competed at Green and Gold for 4 years, and we all know everyone who competes. So Chris, I'll ask you, and I know the answer to this question, is it going to have any effect at all that you might know one of the teams or both the teams?
It's not. However, if the teams believe that it is, I don't want to be the cause for that. So I told them this.
I'll put it this way, Chris, you can judge this round and no other round in this tournament. You are conflicted out of every other round.
Perfect. Again, it's not my call. I will do whatever the teams. But again, it's up to them.
I mean, I'll put it to you. If you need me to move him, I will try and find you another judge. But
Your Honor, since I do believe I don't want this to be a big deal, and we were just trying to be safe with knowing the identity of the teams. But if you're correct that he would know any team, then that's fine, and we're on the same playing ground, so we're fine with keeping this judge.
Okay, great. I appreciate it, and like I said, I trust that Chris won't let it affect anything.
Yeah, but I'm sorry that was inconvenient. I just didn't know that.
No, I appreciate you bringing it. That's why I'm here. You bring it to my attention, then I can try and fix it if I can. So I appreciate it. We'll give you the all clear in just a few moments. We just have a few more courtrooms to check, and then we'll let you know you can get started.
Okay, sounds good.
Hi, y'all are good to go ahead and start the round.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll now begin. Actually, before we begin, plaintiff, can you tell me real quick, will we be seeing a negligence per se case or a battery case in today's?
We will be pursuing the charge of battery in today's case.
Perfect. All right. Well, now that we've given the all clear, I will now call the case of the estate of Genesis Petrillo versus Harper Martini. Do we have any pretrial matters from the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. Before we begin, we'd like to constructively tender documents to the bench. I believe you have access to a bench book that contains the relevant case materials, such as the stipulation, special instructions, case law in the state of Midlands. Is that correct?
That is correct. So right now I have the Midlands Rules of Evidence as well as all the exhibits pulled up. So if there's anything else that you need me to access, I have access to it, but just give me a second to turn there.
Awesome. And the plaintiff would like to bring to your attention stipulation 1 specifically, which stipulates that all exhibits of evidence are pre-numbered and pre-labeled. This means that exhibit 5 may be entered before exhibit 1 and vice versa.
Okay.
We'd also like to bring your honor's attention to rules 603 and 615 in the Midland Rules of Evidence. Pursuant to rule 603, we would request that all witnesses are recognized as pre-sworn to testify truthfully.
Granted.
And pursuant to Rule 615, we would request that Your Honor recognizes witnesses as constructively sequestered, except for if defense designates a party representative at this time.
We will invoke the rule. Plaintiff, do you have any party representatives for the purpose of that rule?
We do not.
And defense, will you have any party representatives?
Yes, we do, Your Honor. Harper Martini will be in trial as our party.
Okay. Miss Martini, with everyone exception of Miss Martini, they will be outside the scope of this jury.
Yes, Your Honor. As well, we would like to ask Your Honor's preferences that we state whenever we constructively approach the witnesses, opposing counsel, and the bench.
You don't have to ask constructively approach with this whole Zoom environment. I will say my one request is when dealing with evidence, I want you to act as if the witness has the evidence in front of them. So lay the foundation without any screen sharing or so. After entering the exhibit, we will act as if the screen sharing is publishing it to the jury. So does any questions on that from either side? Okay, perfect.
Yes, Your Honor. Lastly, the plaintiff will like to make appearances. My name is Mackenzie Porter, and I will be representing the estates of Genesis Petrillo in today's case, along with my co-counsel, Haley Huggins.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And Camden Vokey.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
With that, the plaintiff has finished with pretrial matters.
All right. Defense, any pretrial matters?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. My name is Alexis Pineda, and these are my co-counsel, Heather Worth.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
And Ava Singh.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Today, we represent the defendant, Harper Martini.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
And Your Honor, when we are performing objections, can those constructively be heard outside of the jury like it's common in this jurisdiction?
Yes.
And Your Honor, just to clarify what you said about screen sharing, for exhibits that are already entered, do we have to ask permission for those?
No. For exhibits that are already entered, you may assume that they've already been entered. And again, when you share the screen, it's if you're publishing it to the jury.
Yes, Your Honor. So should we just narrate what we're doing instead of asking permission?
Please. Actually, no. Still ask for permission when you do so. But because it's already entered, I'm not going to ask opposing counsel if they have any objections or of that sort.
Got it, Your Honor. With that, the defense is ready for trial.
All right. Before we begin, want to make sure that my co-judge, Mr. Dean, everything ready to begin?
Everything ready on my end.
Perfect. With that, plaintiff, do you have an opening statement?
May it please the court. I am afraid that Harper is going to kill me. These are some of Genesis Petrillo's final words. As the plaintiff today, we hold the burden of proof. The burden of proof in today's case is by a preponderance of evidence. Simply put, more likely than not to have occurred. And it's important to note today that battery is not murder. The bar is much lower. Battery is the intent to cause harm. We must prove that the defendant, more likely than not, purposefully mixed pesticide into the wine that was gifted to Genesis Petrillo with the intent to cause any harm. The defendant has hated Genesis from the beginning. Genesis was in a relationship with the defendant's only child, Casey. The defendant thought Genesis wasn't good enough. The defendant thought Genesis was a terrible influence. The defendant thought they should have never been together. The defendant thought Genesis should just disappear. In fact, there was nothing more that the defendant wanted. For years throughout Casey and Genesis's relationship, tensions grew between the defendant and Genesis, and it only worsened when the couple got engaged. The defendant was in a vulnerable place prior to the wedding. The defendant believed that they were losing their only child. Genesis and Casey had planned to leave the country after their wedding, and Casey was always supposed to take over the family winery. But that wasn't happening anymore with Genesis's plans. The defendant's relationship with Casey had been in jeopardy for as long as Genesis was around, but this was the final straw. The defendant decided that the only way to stay in their child's life was to get rid of Genesis. The clock was ticking with a wedding date set. Genesis made clear to the defendant that this date would be the end of their interactions, that not only Genesis and Casey planned to move out of the country, but they planned to cease contact altogether. The defendant's first attempt was to convince Casey that this relationship wasn't right, that it wasn't going to last. The defendant then briefly attempted to mend the broken relationship with Genesis. When that failed, the defendant resorted to offering $300,000 for Genesis to abandon Casey. That didn't work. Time was running out, and the defendant was desperate. And the defendant looked to a last resort. On June 7th, the night of the rehearsal dinner for the wedding, the pesticide used heavily in their winery inside a Cara wine bottle. This wine bottle was then personally gifted to Genesis under the excuse of making amends. It was the defendant's final attempt to save not only their family, but their business. It was solved. The defendant would have protected Casey from what they saw as a mistake and saved the future of their business. You'll hear from the defendant's son, Casey, today. Casey will tell you about the plan to move, about the tensions rising all the way to the wedding date. You will hear from Lonnie Paris, a journalist and investigator. Lonnie will tell you how the two are fighting the very night Genesis was poisoned. She will tell you how she found an empty bottle of pesticide in the wine bottling area. You'll hear from Angel Rodriguez, a friend of Genesis and Casey, who will tell you about how Harper wanted Genesis to just disappear. Angel will tell you how Harper had a can of bug-off pesticide special for Genesis because he's such a pest. Angel will tell you about how Genesis died shortly after drinking the wine gifted to him. And it's important to know that when the defendant was notified that someone at the wedding rehearsal was hospitalized, they didn't ask who. In fact, the only thing the defendant said was, Genesis got poisoned. I guess we'll have to cancel the wedding. The defendant then went into Genesis's bedroom to dispose of the evidence. The defendant had the access. The pesticide that killed Genesis was one the defendant was not only familiar with, but uses daily. The defendant had the motive. With everything on the line, there was nothing to lose. Blinded by desperation, they felt they had no other choice. There was no effort left to make, no time left to give, nowhere else to turn, and the defendant made a deadly choice. At the end of today's trial, the plaintiff is confident that you will find the defendant liable.
Thank you. Defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
May it please the court. Not every story has a villain. Members of the jury, I want you to think about every story you've ever been told. I want you to think about the characters, the plot, the conflict, and I want you to notice that almost every one of these stories has a bad guy, a villain. But the thing is, these stories are just that, stories. The works of fiction, like fairy tales in today's case, is the truth. There's no magic wishes, there's no convenient plot twists, and there definitely isn't an evil mother-in-law trying to kill the groom. The truth is that on June 8th, 2019, Genesis Petrillo dies. And his death is a tragedy, but it's reality. Don't let the plaintiff turn today's case into a work of fiction and create an unnecessary villain out of Harper Martini. Harper Martini is a name you'll hear throughout today's trial. You'll hear that Miss Martini is a successful businesswoman who works her way up to being the owner of the #1 winery right here in Midlands. You'll hear that she'll do anything for her son, Casey Soto. You'll hear that back when business wasn't doing so well at Miss Martini's winery, the company was forced to switch to cheaper and less safe chemical pesticides. Chemical pesticides that its employees were unable to safely handle. And you'll hear that these unsafe practices could have caused the death of Genesis Petrillo. On June 7th, 2019, Mr. Petrillo drinks contaminated wine from the winery and he passes away the very next morning on what should have been the happiest day of his life, his wedding day. Members of the jury, in today's trial, you'll hear from Austin Lewis, the head winemaker at the winery, and he'll tell you that company oversights could have caused the Caro wine that Genesis Petrillo drank to be contaminated. You'll hear that this same Caro wine was sealed immediately after it was made, leaving no opportunity to contaminate it after it was sealed and before it was gifted to Genesis Petrillo. The truth is that on June 8th, 2019, Genesis Petrillo died, but despite the plaintiff's claims, today's case is an accident. There's no villain. Now, today, the plaintiff is pursuing a claim of battery against the defendant, Harper Martini. They must prove, by a preponderance of the evidence, that Harper Martini committed an act of battery, and that this act is more likely than not, meaning that it is the most likely explanation for Genesis Petrillo's death. So let's break down what that means. First, the plaintiff must prove an act by Harper Martini. Second, the plaintiff must prove that Ms. Martini had an intent to harm. And third, the plaintiff must prove that that intended harm actually took place. Members of the jury, it's not enough to portray Harper Martini as a villain. The plaintiff must prove it as well. And we expect that by the end of today's trial, they won't do that. Today's case isn't a fairy tale. And at the end of today's trial, it's in your hands to ensure that it doesn't turn into a nightmare for Harper Martini. At the end of today's trial, we will ask you to find Harper Martini not liable. Because not every story has a villain. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 second before we begin the plaintiff. All right, I am ready to proceed. Mr. Dean, are you ready to proceed?
I'm ready as well.
Perfect. Plaintiff, any witnesses to call?
Yes, the plaintiff would like to call our first witness to the stand, Casey Soto.
All right. Mr. Soto, reminder that you have been previously sworn at this time. And with that, you may proceed.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
My name's Casey Soto.
And can you tell me why you're here today?
I was subpoenaed, but I guess I'm here to talk about everything that happened with Genesis, the wedding, and I guess specifically my mother, Harper Martini.
How would you describe your relationship with Harper?
I would just say emotionally charged. It was just the two of us when I was growing up, and I know how Harper invested all of her energy into raising me. Throughout my whole life, Harper would sometimes take things a little too far, but it was no exception. It was no exception to Genesis when they came into my life.
How did you and Genesis meet?
We actually met at a winery at Rosie and Pedro in 2012. We dated for 3 years before I introduced him to Harper, which was in 2015.
Your Honor, the plaintiff would I'd like to ask permission to screen share a demonstrative at this time.
Okay, has this been shown to opposing counsel?
Yes, Your Honor.
Opposing counsel, is there any objection to this?
No objections, Your Honor.
Then you may do so.
All right, moving forward. After Genesis and Harper met, how did that go? How was that interaction?
Not good. There was a bad first interaction at Peonia Estates, my mom's winery, and it just seemed to never end. But things with Genesis and I were really good, actually. So good that we actually got engaged.
When did you get engaged?
In 2012.
All right. Moving forward a little bit, your mother, Harper Martini, can you describe what she did for a living?
Yeah, my mom was in the wine industry. In 2015, she actually opened her own wine, vineyard named Peonia Estates.
All right. And did Genesis and Harper actually meet at Peonia Estates?
Yes, they did.
All right, so let's move back a little bit about the engagement. What happened after the two of you were engaged?
We had been planning, or I had been planning to propose to him, but then he actually beat me to it.
And after he beat you to the engagement, how was the relationship between Genesis and Harper?
Things got objectively worse between Harper and Genesis.
Objection, Your Honor, to speculation under Rule 701. Mr. Soto, this testimony is not rationally based on Mr. Soto's perception. He can't delve into the mindset and speculate about how this relationship got objectively worse.
Okay, response?
If I may respond, Your Honor, I don't believe that my witness was delving into the mindset of specifically Harper Martini or Genesis Petrillo, but really the rationally based perception of observing their interactions together. And I believe that my witness can testify to any observations that he has made through the course of his relationships.
Response? Yes, response?
The witness wasn't testifying to what he observed. He said things got objectively worse between my mother and Mr. Petrillo. That is speculation, Your Honor.
Okay, I think I tend to agree with counsel. I think we need to lay a little bit more foundation. I think he was about to get into that, but I want to hear the foundation first before I allow that testimony in. So I'm going to sustain the objection.
Your Honor, move to strike.
Stricken.
Yes, Your Honor. Can you describe why you felt the relationship between Harper and Genesis?
Yeah, so they would constantly, if they were planning the wedding, they would constantly swear or yell at each other over the phone. There was a time where Genesis actually didn't tell Harper about the proposal, and that kind of freaked Harper out. I guess when Genesis first tasted Harper Martini's wine, that set off a bad interaction between the two, so on and so forth.
Thank you, Mr. Soto. So let's talk a little bit about the wedding planning process. Can you describe how that went?
Yeah, originally Genesis and I had planned the venue at Rosie and Pedro, which is actually the first place we met. We found that it would be symbolic if we had it there because that's initially where we started our first love.
You say it was originally at this location. Did this change?
Well, yes. Harper made an offer to us. She wanted us to have at her own winery, Peonia Estates. If we agreed, she was going to pay for a large portion of the wedding.
What ended up happening with that offer?
Well, we took it, of course. Genesis agreed that we should take it, actually.
Why is that?
Recently, Genesis has gotten a job offer in Paris. We took the offer from Harper in order to save money to make the big move together right after the wedding.
Was Harper aware of these plans?
No, not at first. I knew better to tell Harper before we actually made the move. I wanted to wait until after we would be able, or we would be too far away from Harper, so Harper couldn't stop us.
What made you believe that Harper would try to stop you from moving?
I've always been Harper's son my whole life. I felt that she was attached to the idea of me running the winery one day, but that was just never what I wanted to do. It was never my intention to run Peony Estates. It made it hard, and I felt like I was running out of time to tell Harper my true feelings.
Did Harper Martini ever find out about these plans to move to France?
Yes. During the process of the wedding plans, we had a casino party. Genesis left a drunk voicemail to Harper mentioning our plans to move, among other things.
Would you recognize this voicemail?
Yes, I would.
Your Honor, the plaintiff asks permission to screen share and enter Exhibit 8, which has already been pre-admitted based upon Stipulation 3.
Okay, then you may do so.
All right, Mr. Soto, does this look like it's a accurate copy of this voicemail we were discussing?
Yes, it does.
Could you read for me the part starting with, "It's time for Harper to be an adult," about halfway down?
Yes. It's time for Harper to be an adult and know the truth. Casey, me, our future kids, your grandkids, we're all going to live our lives as far away from you as possible. You'll never see any of us, and you don't deserve us.
Your Honor, we ask at this time to switch to screen sharing the timeline once again.
That's fine.
And Mr. Soto, how did Harper react to this voicemail?
Well, she screamed about needing someone to take over the family business. Harper did threaten Genesis, a threat that we were...
The improper character evidence under Rule 404. Opposing counsel is attempting to use this prior act of Miss Martini threatening Mr. Petrillo to establish a trait of violence. That because Miss Martini was violent on this day, that she was violent on the day in question in today's case.
Okay, response?
If I may respond, Your Honor, I would just say we are not entering this this threat or this action as going to prove the character of Harper Martini, but more so the subsequent action of my witness, Casey Soto, and how his testimony were laying this foundation for how he's going to act and what he is going to do throughout the events of his life and through his wedding process. So we're not using this as showing Harper Martini's character, but really more so to lay the proper foundation for Casey's testimony today.
Final response on those grounds?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff's entire case is based on the fact that Harper Martini intended to poison Genesis Petrillo. This threat is establishing a character trait of violence because it's trying to prove that on the day in question, Miss Martini was just as violent as she was when she made this statement, when she had this act. In fact, Your Honor, during opening statements, opposing counsel characterized Miss Martini as being violent. They characterized her as acting in accordance with the way she acted when she gave this threat.
Yeah, but no need. I think that if they was talking about her being violent to other individuals, that would be an issue. But since we're talking specifically with the relationship with Genesis, you can talk about that specific act. So I'm going to overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Soto, I'll repeat my question. How did Harper react to hearing this voicemail?
Harper screamed about she needing someone to take over the family business. She made a threat to Genesis, a threat that we're full of disapproval that we are actually accustomed to at this point. And especially the hopeful part was that Harper said it was terrible for me to leave her without any other family.
And when did this interaction happen?
This was in May of 2019, before the wedding was set to happen. The tension was still there in June in 2019, the month of the wedding.
Can you describe this tension in a little more detail for us?
Sure. During one of the arguments between Genesis and Harper at the rehearsal dinner, I remember Genesis saying that Harper couldn't even pay him off.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay under Rule 801.
Okay. And this is, yes, please.
I believe that this is an exception to hearsay under 803.2, which is an excited utterance. This happened in a conversation which was very shocking and startling, and Genesis Petrillo said this statement under that same shock, and therefore it is more likely to be true than just any other statement made in conversation because of this context.
Response to the 803.2 exception?
Honor. This is not an exception to hearsay under Rule 803.2. There has been no foundation laid that establishes that this statement was made during a startling event while the declarant was under stress. No foundation has been laid to establish that. Right now, this is just an out-of-court statement being used for the truth of the matter asserted.
Okay. Final word. How does this meet the predicate 803.2?
Yes, Your Honor. I do believe that my witness had testified that there was tension happening and that this was a specific argument that had been happening and there had been a lot of anger. And if opposing counsel would like, we can go into more detail on that. But I do believe that the context has been set and that the predicate has been laid for this to have been more of an excited statement rather than just a normal statement said in a normal conversation.
Well, then let's do that then. So lay more foundation since you said you have it. Lay more foundation. So for this, at this time, the objection is sustained.
Move to strike, Your Honor.
Stricken.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Soto, could you describe a little bit the context of these arguments happening at the rehearsal dinner?
Yeah, even before the rehearsal dinner, actually, there was tension when both Harper and Genesis were saying their speeches. Even after I asked actually Blair to separate the two so there wouldn't be any more. It was just upsetting about the whole situation, to be honest.
And how did Harper and Genesis appear during the specific interaction?
At the rehearsal dinner?
Yes.
Heated, I would say.
All right. Moving forward, how did you respond after this?
Well, I was actually ready to cancel the wedding, to be honest.
Did the wedding get canceled?
No, Harper kept going on about how canceling the wedding would be such a good idea and that I would stay Midlands with her. But the wedding wasn't canceled, not at all. I mean, first, when Genesis was still here, the wedding was still going to happen.
Right. Can you describe in a little more detail the rehearsal dinner for me?
Yeah, we had the rehearsal dinner on June 7th. There was a lot of congratulations and speeches. Harper gave a toast and gave a bottle of wine to Genesis. It was Harper's new wine named Cara.
What happened after that?
The toast came as a bit of a shock to both me and Genesis, but the night went on and I eventually went to bed.
Mr. Soto, can you tell me about the next morning?
Yes. I first heard from Harper that something was wrong. At first, it was just that Genesis was missing. And then I was later informed by Angel Rodriguez that Genesis was actually in a coma.
And what happened after that?
We went to the hospital, but we didn't make it in time.
What do you mean?
When we got to the hospital at 9:32, we were 5 minutes late. Genesis died at 9:27 a.m.
Mr. Soto, did you ever find out how Genesis died?
Yes. I requested the medical reports and the death certificate shortly after the funeral. I wanted to know what happened to him, and I felt like I had the right since I was marrying Genesis.
Would you recognize a copy of this death certificate?
Yes, I would.
Your Honor, the plaintiff asks permission to screen share and enter Exhibit 7, which has previously been admitted under the same stipulation.
You may do so.
All right, Mr. Soto, could you tell me from this report, how did Genesis Petrillo die?
It was made clear to me that he ingested pesticides from the wine, which was the most likely source of poisoning.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Soto. No further questions.
All right, thank you. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Soto. Now, I know that this can be difficult, so I'm going to try and limit my questions, okay?
That's fine. And call me Casey, it's easier for the both of us.
So like you said on direct examination, Casey, you were subpoenaed to be here today, right?
Yes, that's true.
And these plaintiff attorneys, they asked you to testify against your mother, didn't they?
Yes, I guess they just want the full story of what happened.
You're aware that you're on trial today because your mother is being accused of poisoning your fiance.
Yes.
I want to talk about whether or not that's logical. First of all, there were friends and family present at your wedding rehearsal, right?
Yes, that's true.
There were caterers in the kitchen.
Yes.
There were wedding guests all around you.
Yes.
And these wedding guests, they were drinking all kinds of alcohol, right?
Yes.
Including wine.
Yes.
And later in the night, your mother made a big show out of gifting Mr. Petrillo a bottle of Cara wine.
Yes, she did.
Like you said, it was during the toast.
Yes.
And she gave your fiance that bottle of wine in front of all of the wedding rehearsal guests.
Yes.
So it wasn't a secret that she gave him that bottle of wine.
No, it wasn't.
Now, Miss Martini certainly wasn't following that bottle of wine around the entire night, was she?
Not that I know of.
In fact, Mr. Soto, that bottle of Cara wine was in front of you for most of the night.
Yes, it was put on our table.
And you never once saw your mom stop you from drinking from that bottle of wine?
No.
Because you don't believe that she would ever put your life at risk, right?
I sure hope not.
In fact, Mr. Soto, you never saw your mother prevent anyone from drinking from that bottle of Cara wine.
No, not that I know of. I left the wedding dinner actually pretty early that night.
Exactly. You left the wedding rehearsal early.
Yes.
You left before Mr. Petrillo.
Yeah, I did.
And you left before Miss Martini.
Yes.
So you can't tell the jury what happened with that bottle of Cara wine after you left the wedding rehearsal.
No, I can't.
So let's talk about what you can tell the jury, Mr. Soto. You can tell the jury that you've never seen your mother try and harm Mr. Petrillo in any way, right?
I'm sorry?
You can tell the jury that you've never seen your mother try and harm Mr. Petrillo in any way, right?
Objection, Your Honor, to 4-4, more prejudicial than probative.
Okay, elaborate.
I believe that the way that opposing counsel is phrasing this question is going more to prejudice the jury rather than going to the facts of today and talking about this one specific instance, and is going into previous context, which is not necessarily as relevant as proving this one specific context in today's trial.
Okay. Response?
Your Honor, in order for a line of testimony to be substantially more prejudicial than it is probative, it needs to be outweighed by a danger of unfair prejudice. In today's case, this line of testimony is extremely probative because it goes to indicate that Miss Martini wasn't violent with Mr. Petrillo. And today's case is a case of battery in which Miss Martini is being accused of poisoning Mr. Petrillo. And because of that, this is relevant and this is not substantially more prejudicial than it is probative.
I tend to agree with counsel. I don't think this line of questioning is prejudicial at all. If you don't think that the way that it's being asked is correct, you feel free to bring this up on redirect. But the objection is overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Soto, just to clarify, you cannot tell the jury today that you've seen your mom try and hurt Genesis Petrillo in any way.
Not physically, no.
And you've certainly never seen her try and poison a bottle of Cara wine, right?
Not to my knowledge.
Mr. Soto, you have no idea how the pesticides got into that Cara bottle of wine.
No, I don't.
You have no idea how your fiance was poisoned.
No.
Mr. Soto, you don't know if today's case is an accident, do you?
No, I don't.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Any redirects for this witness?
No redirect, Your Honor.
All right. Mr. Soto, thank you for your testimony today. And 1 second before we begin with our next witness. All right. Do we have any further witnesses for the plaintiff?
The plaintiff is calling Lonnie Paris.
Okay. Ms. Paris, reminder that you have been previously sworn at this time. And with that, you may proceed.
Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Lonnie Paris, and I'm an investigative journalist. I also have a master's degree in science journalism that just perfectly encompasses my passions of journalism and environmental science.
And why are you testifying here today?
I have been extremely dedicated to covering this case in depth, so I'm here to provide my testimony as to what I've witnessed.
Can you tell me about how you learned about Peony Estates?
Of course. I first received a tip from Danny Francasio, the owner of Rosie and Pedro's Winery, saying that Peony Estates was committing several health code violations through its misuse of pesticide.
Do you receive tips like this often?
Tips are pretty common given my reputation. I have businesses constantly contacting me with potential stories, claiming how their rivals are engaging in every illegal activity. Because of that, I have to take every tip with a grain of salt.
Objection, Your Honor. Under Rule 404, this witness is testifying that because she receives lots of tips in the past about how competitors are always talking about their other competitors, and these are apparently false claims, that this tip with Danny Francasi was also false and that Peony Estates wasn't mishandling pesticides.
Okay, response on those grounds?
Your Honor, I do not believe we are using this testimony to go in that direction. We are simply asking if she decided to then take this tip seriously. It establishes a timeline for when she decided to then look into Peony Estates Winery for any type of misuse of pesticide that has been reported, whether or not she delayed her investigation. It goes to subsequent action.
Response, Your Honor?
Sure.
Your Honor, they don't need to go into the statements by other competitors if they just want to talk about the statement by Danny Francasio in this particular tip. They're using that for propensity.
I don't tend to see a character trait at all that can be used for propensity with that, so I'm going to overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Paris, did you take this tip seriously?
Unfortunately, I did not. There usually isn't a legitimate story behind them. But I was intrigued about the prospect of Peony Estates producing poisoned wine. So I searched the internet to see if I could find any additional information, but I couldn't find anything about anyone getting sick. So at this time, I just pushed the project to the back burner.
Were you at the winery on June 7th, 2019?
Yes, I was. That was the day of the rehearsal and rehearsal dinner.
And what were you doing there?
Well, I had been caught sneaking in before, so this time I snuck in with a new disguise as a member of the catering staff, and I easily made my way to the restricted area where I unlocked the padlock and entered the bottling area.
And what did you find in the bottling area?
There was a single bottle of wine sitting on a shelf with no other bottles near it. It had Cara on the label. And then I heard loud shouting.
Who was shouting?
Well, at first it was hard to hear, but as I made my way closer down the hallway, I could tell there were two voices. They belonged to Harper Martini and Genesis Petrillo. I'd been around them previously.
Do you know what they were arguing about?
I'm not really sure. They had left the room once I got close.
Did you go into the room?
I did, because I saw a crumpled up envelope on the floor.
And what did you do once seeing the envelope?
Well, my curiosity got the best of me and I just had to open it. And inside was a letter addressed to Genesis Petrillo, and I realized that I'd stumbled on something big. So I quickly took a picture of the letter and put it right back where I found it because I heard footsteps approaching.
What happened next?
Well, I hid, obviously, and that's when I saw Harper come back into the room and pick the letter up.
What did the defendant do with this letter?
Harper said, I forgot I should get rid of this after Genesis tossed it back in my face. Then Harper burned the letter in a furnace nearby.
Do you know who wrote this letter?
Harper Martini.
How do you know
Lack of foundation as to whether or not Harper Martini wrote this letter.
Okay, response?
My next question is, how does she know that she wrote this letter?
Okay, I'm going to give them a little bit leeway to lay that foundation. If you believe that they have not, please feel free to re-raise your objection, but overruled at this time.
Yes, Your Honor.
How do you know that Harper Martini wrote this letter?
Well, in addition to Harper's initials being at the end of the letter and Harper's statements I had overheard, I was able to recognize Harper's handwriting based on some earlier investigation in Harper's office. See, Harper had several handwritten post-it notes stuck on the desk.
Objection, Your Honor, lack of personal knowledge. The witness just testified that she saw Harper Martini's initials on this letter. However, the letters are H and M, and this witness can't testify for certain if, first of all, those are in fact initials, and second of all, they are Harper Martini's initials.
Sorry, finish.
This witness also just testified that she saw sticky notes, handwritten notes by Miss Martini in Miss Martini's office. But again, Your Honor, this witness can't know for certain if those notes were actually written by Harper Martini. It doesn't have a name on them, and I believe that this witness can't clarify for certain if those sticky notes were written by Harper Martini. They could be consistent with anyone at the winery.
Response?
Your Honor, we're about to enter Exhibit 24, which is the letter. According to Stipulation 4, I believe it's that all witnesses must identify with any writing that is theirs. It has already been established that this writing is Harper Martini's. In Harper Martini's own deposition, they will be calling Harper Martini. Harper Martini will talk about this letter. As I said, I'm going to enter this letter in which it will be authenticated.
Yeah, no need. I think this witness has laid the predicate for authentication purposes. I think if something that you want to challenge, you can do so on cross-examination. I think at this point, we're on a discussion of weight, not admissibility. So I'm going to overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Would you recognize a copy of this letter?
I would.
Do you recognize this letter?
I do.
Is this a fair and accurate copy?
It is.
Your Honor, permission to screen share Exhibit 24. And
this exhibit has not been entered, has it?
No, it has not. I'm trying to find. Has it been changed or altered in any way?
No.
I'm trying to find the exhibit. Okay, sorry. Exhibit 24. If I could have the box screen share Exhibit 24.
Not yet. Don't screen share yet. We haven't entered the exhibit. Are you offering the exhibit?
I'm offering it to evidence, yes.
Opposing counsel, any objections?
No objection.
You're on mute. Oh. With that, no problem. With that, Exhibit 24 is entered, and now you may screen share to publish.
Can you read for me the sentence starting with otherwise aloud?
Certainly. Otherwise, I will take you out of the picture the hard way.
Now, who is this letter addressed to?
Genesis Petrillo.
And what did the defendant do after burning this letter?
Harper left the scene, so I decided to follow her, and she eventually led me into the bottling area.
We can stop screen sharing Exhibit 24. What did Harper Martini do in the bottling area?
I saw her walk out of the room with the bottle of Cara wine that I saw before, but I was unable to follow Harper out since I was preoccupied with another huge discovery.
What did you see?
I found an open almost empty container of what looked exactly like bug-off pesticide sitting right next to where they bottled all the wine. So I poured the rest of the canister contents into a container so I could get it analyzed.
Your Honor, permission to screen share Exhibit 11, which has already been pre-admitted.
You may.
Do you recognize this exhibit?
I do.
Can you tell us what the lab results show underneath additional notes by client or additional notes by analyst? My apologies.
Yes, it says sample consistent with commercial pesticide in both appearance and odor.
Do you know what Genesis Petrillo died from?
Yes, through my top connections, I was able to obtain a copy of Genesis Petrillo's death certificate, which indicated that Genesis had died of respiratory arrest caused by pesticide poisoning.
No further questions at this time.
All right, thank you. Cross,
Yes, Your Honor.
you may proceed.
Ms. Paris, you were at Peony Estates on June 7th, right?
Correct.
When you were at Peony, or that was the day before Genesis Petrillo died, right?
Yes, that was the rehearsal dinner.
While you were at Peony Estates, you went into the bottling area, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where you found that canister of pesticide that you were talking about?
Yes, right by the wine.
When you saw that canister of pesticide, you poured some of the pesticide into a different container, right?
Correct.
So you could get that pesticide tested at a lab, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you just showed in direct right now, the lab results?
Correct.
Your Honor, may I put up a copy of Exhibit 11 once again?
You may.
Just give it a second. Sometimes these things take a while. All right, Ms. Paris, now these are the lab results that you're talking about on direct, right?
Correct.
Now, if you look at that one paragraph under additional notes by client, it says that the pesticide canister was actually from your own shed, right?
Right.
It wasn't from Peony Estates?
Correct.
So you were lying earlier on direct when you said that this pesticide canister was from Peony Estates?
Well, no, I mean, I found it in the bottling area, as I said.
You just said that you found it in your shed, right?
Well, no, I found it in the bottling area. I had to tell the person that I brought the lab sample to that I found it in my own shed so that they wouldn't be suspicious and so that they wouldn't send out these other information to business competitors, because they tend to want this kind of information. So I had to tell them that it was from my personal shed, but I did find it at Peony Estates.
In the second sentence, it says that you repeatedly requested that the results not be shared with anyone else, right?
Correct. It's for the same reason. I wanted to have my own work to be able to be published. I didn't want anyone else to be able to steal this story.
Well, actually, Ms. Paris, you didn't want anyone else to see this because you knew that if they saw this, they would find out that it came from your shed, right?
Well, no, I just wanted to have the story for myself so that I could have, so that I could become a better investigator and get this story out.
Well, let's talk about you getting this story out and becoming a better investigative journalist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're testifying today voluntarily, right?
Correct.
You're even writing a story about your testimony, isn't that right?
Absolutely. I think it's a great experience for a story.
Ms. Paris, you would agree with me that a story about a murder is much more entertaining than a story about an accident, right?
Maybe, but I really am dedicated to this case. I really just want to get the truth.
Now, Ms. Paris, so far this story has helped your career, hasn't it?
I wouldn't say so yet.
Ms. Paris, you lost a job a couple years ago, right?
Correct. Now I work as a freelance investigator.
Well, your boss told you that if he liked this story, you'd become a full-time investigative journalist once again, right?
Possibly. I think my story today, based on my testimony, could aid with that as well.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Any redirect for this witness?
No, not at this time.
All right, with that, Ms. Paris, you're excused. Thank you for your testimony today. 1 second before we begin with the next witness. All right. Plaintiff, any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Angel Rodriguez to the stand.
All right, Ms. Rodriguez, a reminder that you have been previously sworn at this time. And with that, you may proceed.
Ms. Rodriguez, can you introduce yourself to the court today?
Yes. Hi, I'm Miss Rodriguez.
And Ms. Rodriguez, why are you here today?
So I volunteered to come here today to talk about what I saw at Casey and Genesis' wedding rehearsal.
How do you know Casey and Genesis?
So the three of us met 4 years ago at Chuggy Sports Bar, and I remember this because it was the night of the annual Kappa Kappa Rafa raffle. I graduated in 2010, but don't mistake, I'm still very involved, and I love my little sisters. Anyway, me and Casey and Genesis all ended up becoming really good friends.
And Ms. Rodriguez, do you know the defendant in this case, Harper Martini?
Yes. In 2019, Harper started getting really involved with all the wedding planning, which really cramped my style because I was part of the wedding party and I've thrown hundreds of pledge parties. How different could a wedding be? But Harper and I end up spending tons of time together.
And Ms. Rodriguez, I want to talk a little bit now about Genesis and Harper's relationship together. So what did it look like when the two of them were together?
Well, things were always tense, and I always wanted to be invisible when they were in the room together. And I love being the center of attention. I was the president of Kappa Kappa Rafa back in my day, so it's really hard to make me feel that way.
What do you mean by that? How were things tense?
So whenever I saw them together, Harper would just insult Genesis over and over and call them names, yelling. They were constantly arguing, and I don't really like confrontation, so it made me super uncomfortable, and it really looked like a Kappa Kappa Rafa sister cat fight. It was so trashy.
Ms. Rodriguez, I want to talk a little bit now about the day of the wedding rehearsal. Did things seem better between the defendant and Genesis on that day?
No, they were arguing even more, and Harper said some really mean things.
What do you remember the defendant saying?
So Harper said that Genesis should just leave and save his family the headache. Otherwise, I'll make you disappear. Can you believe the audacity?
Ms. Rodriguez, how did Genesis react to hearing that?
He didn't say anything at all. I think that we were all really shocked about what Harper said, but later on, Genesis and I went to go confront her about it.
And what happened when you and Genesis confronted the defendant about these statements?
So Harper grabbed Genesis' arm and dragged him into the hallway.
Objection, Your Honor, to improper character evidence. Opposing counsel is using this pool to establish a trait of violence from Ms. Martini on a past occasion. And while we do understand that it's with the victim, Your Honor, we still believe this is being used for propensity as defined under Rule 404.
Response?
Well, Your Honor, this event happened on the same exact day, just hours before this alleged poisoning happened.
May I respond?
Please.
Rule 404 doesn't require a separate date. It requires two particular occasions. They're using this example earlier in the day of a pool to show that there was violence later in the day with a poisoning. So this is 404, despite it being in the same day, Your Honor.
So what's your response, counsel, final word to the specific reasons for using this is for propensity purposes?
Your Honor, we're not trying to show that the defendant was being violent towards Genesis Petrillo by grabbing his arm. We're just trying to establish how this conversation happened outside of the earshot of the witness who's testifying right now, Angel Rodriguez.
I'm okay with the statements getting in, but I think with the grabbing the arm, I'm going to sustain the objection as to that only limited part of the testimony. That's my ruling. So partly sustained.
And move
Yes,
to
Your Honor.
part of the testimony, Your Honor.
Yes, that part of the testimony will be stricken.
So, Ms. Rodriguez, what happened when they went into the hallway?
So I don't know what they talked about, but when Genesis came back, he just had a complete blank face.
And did Genesis say anything?
All he said to me was to keep away from Harper. I think she's going to kill me.
Object to hearsay as to statements by Mr. Petrillo.
Response, Your Honor. Yes, Your Honor. These statements fall under an exception, 804B2. This is an exception to hearsay, as these are statements made by an unavailable declarant, because the declarant here, Genesis Petrillo, is dead, made about a statement under the impression of imminent death.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Please.
Rule 804 has the two prongs. The first one is that the victim be deceased or unavailable, and we believe that has been established. But as to the second part, to this being a statement of imminent death, there's no foundation for that, Your Honor. This exception applies to a patient's dying words on a hospital bed, not to a witness being scared of someone. That foundation hasn't been laid, and this is still hearsay.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think the definition of imminent is clear, and that's not the case here. Do you have any other exceptions for this rule?
Well, Your Honor, a statement under impression of imminent death doesn't mean that imminent death exactly follows right after. If the declarant is worried that they're legitimately going to die at that moment, even if they don't necessarily die just then, that doesn't mean that the statements aren't representative of that mindset.
I tend to disagree, as well as I think that the statement is not necessarily, the statements aren't intended to use statements about the actual death. It's supposed to be with that condition, then the statement relates to something else. And again, I don't think that predicate can be met. So I'm going to sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Answer by the witness, Your Honor.
The answer is stricken, correct.
So, Ms. Rodriguez, did you ever see Harper again that day before the dinner happened?
Yes, I saw her an hour before the dinner walking towards the kitchen.
And what was the defendant doing walking towards the kitchen?
So Harper was holding a can of bug killer, and I'm not really sure what brand, but I saw the word pesticide on it, and I asked what she was doing with it.
And how did the defendant respond to your question?
Harper said it's for Genesis because Genesis is such a pest, and just walked away.
Ms. Rodriguez, I'm going to talk a little bit about the rehearsal dinner itself. Just tell us the order of how things happened.
So it started off with toast with the couple, and then we ate dinner, and then Harper gave a gift to Genesis. I've been to better dinners at the Kappa Kappa Rafa house.
You mentioned the defendant gave a gift to Genesis. When did that happen?
After dinner and everything, it was around 10 p.m.
And what was that gift?
So Harper brought out a ton of bottles of wine as party favors, and one of them was different, and that's the one that Genesis got.
And do you remember what the label on that bottle said?
Yes, the label said Cara, and it was an extra fancy wine that Harper made at the winery. I don't know much about wines, but it didn't look like the other ones that Harper gave us.
Ms. Rodriguez, do you remember who all drank from that bottle of wine that night?
Well, I was with Genesis the whole entire night, and the only person who drank from the Cara wine was Genesis. And at one point, Genesis gave me a sip to try it, but it tasted like really weird, and I don't really like wine, so I spit it out. And I actually prefer Trulies, they just help me keep my figure.
So, Ms. Rodriguez, moving forward a little bit, later that night, what happened to Genesis?
So over the next hour or so, he had a couple more glasses of the Cara wine, and I didn't really see him drink anything else that night.
And later on in the night, when you were going to bed, what happened?
So he was acting really strange. Like I said, he wasn't really drinking anything but the wine. But already by 11 o'clock, he was having trouble walking, talking. He was completely uncoordinated, and I had never seen him like that before.
Ms. Rodriguez, did you go with Genesis Petrillo to the hospital that night?
Yes. So he started throwing up over and over, and I got really scared. So I ended up calling 911, and I went with him and the EMTs to the hospital.
And after you went to the hospital, did you go back to the winery?
Yes, I got an Uber because I had to tell Casey in person.
And when you got back, did you see the defendant?
Yes, I walked right through the doors, and there was Harper.
And what did the defendant say?
Before I actually said anything, Harper literally said, "Genesis got poisoned. Oh no, we have to cancel the wedding."
Had you told anyone at the winery that Genesis Petrillo was poisoned?
No, I hadn't told anyone there, not even Casey.
I believe that's time.
And no further questions, Your Honor.
Okay. Was there any descriptive? Time's good? We're good? Nothing further from the plaintiff? Sorry. Okay. We're going to proceed with cross.
Yes, Your Honor.
Good morning, Ms. Rodriguez.
Good morning.
I have a few questions about what you saw on June 7th. You saw Miss Martini, you saw Miss Martini give a bottle of wine to Genesis Petrillo, right?
Yes.
But just to be clear, you never saw Miss Martini poison this bottle, right?
No.
And on direct, you talked about how you saw Miss Martini with pesticide in that bottle.
I saw her walking to the kitchen with pesticide.
And you claim that she told you that the pesticide is to kill pests like Genesis?
Yes.
Ms. Rodriguez, you want the jury to believe that Miss Martini went around confessing her plan to kill someone?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative.
Your Honor, this is correct.
I don't think he's delved into that point. Just because it's cross doesn't mean it's not argumentative, but I think that he hasn't delved into that yet. So overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Rodriguez, you want the jury to believe that Miss Martini went around confessing her plan to kill Genesis, right?
No, but I don't think the joke was really funny.
And that's right, Ms. Rodriguez. Ms. Martini said she was joking after she made that statement.
Sure.
Okay, I want to talk more about what you saw about the Cara bottle of wine. Miss Martini gave it to the victim in front of everyone, right?
Yes.
You didn't see her watching the bottle throughout the night.
No.
You didn't see her making sure other people didn't drink that bottle.
No, but she was really busy.
And Ms. Rodriguez, you were able to drink from that bottle. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I didn't drink from it. I took a taste and I spit it out because remember, I only drink Trulies.
I do remember that, Ms. Rodriguez, but when you had it, when you were drinking it, Ms. Martini didn't come up and tell you to stop, right?
No.
Okay, Ms. Rodriguez. Now I want to give the jury a little more context about your testimony. Like you mentioned on direct, you are testifying voluntarily for the plaintiff.
Yes.
You're invested in this case, aren't you?
Well, I would love to see Genesis for my dear. I would love to see justice for Genesis.
Actually, Ms. Rodriguez, you would love to hold Ms. Martini responsible. Isn't that right?
I would just like to see justice.
Ms. Rodriguez, do you want Ms. Martini to be held responsible?
No.
Ms. Rodriguez, you don't recall stating that you want Ms. Martini to be held responsible?
Okay. I'm going to go with yes then.
And Ms. Martini, that's because you and the victim were close, right?
Yeah, we're really good friends.
You've taken this case to justice activists.
Yes.
To lawyers.
Yes.
And to the press.
Yes.
Like you said, you want justice for Genesis by holding Ms. Martini responsible.
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Okay. Any redirect for this witness?
And Your Honor, since it seems like we're out of time, there's no redirect at this time.
Good point. So with that, Ms. Rodriguez, you're excused. Thank you for your testimony today. Plaintiff, anything further, plaintiff?
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff rests our case in chief. If the time allows, we're going to ask for maybe a 5 or 10 minute recess.
I've been doing normally, I want to say 5 minutes for here so that if time allows, we can take a longer one before closing. Defense, is that okay with you?
Yes, Your Honor, that sounds perfect.
So it is 28 here, so we will be back in 5 minutes. Everybody good?
Yes,
Your Honor.
Perfect. If everyone could please, all the competitors, turn your screens on when you come back so I know that you're here, and so we can get started as soon as possible. All right. Is everyone here that needs to be here?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, perfect. And let me just check in with Mr. Dean. Mr. Dean, are we ready to proceed?
Ready when you are, Judge.
Perfect. Defense. Any witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Mr. Austin Lewis to the stand.
All right, Mr. Lewis, a reminder that you have been previously sworn at this time. And with that, you may proceed.
Good morning. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury? I'm sorry, Mr. Lewis. I think you're on mute.
My apologies about that. Good morning, everybody. My name is Austin Lewis.
And what do you do for a living, Mr. Lewis?
Well, I like to say that I'm a part owner, full-time employee, and #1 fan at Peony Estates. I'm the head winemaker, so I'm in charge of our growing, harvesting, bottling, fermenting, aging, all those fun things with wine.
And how are you qualified to oversee all of these important things?
Well, I practically grew up on a winery. You know, my mama used to be in charge of the old Cumberland's Farm place down the road. I learned everything that I know about winemaking from her, really. She'd start every day by waking me up with the Austin Carpe Venum, seize the wine. She was real talented.
So how are you related to today's case?
Well, my entire life is Peony Estates, really. I know the ins and outs of winemaking there.
Let's talk some more about those ins and outs. Where is Peony Estates located?
Well, we're right up next to a swamp called the Solo Swamp. And because of that, we've had a pest problem over at Peony Estates since day one.
How do you address this pest problem?
Well, you got to get rid of the pesky things somehow. And the organic solutions just didn't work too well. You know, they're too expensive. They just weren't that efficient. So we had to move on to chemical pesticide. And it was a difficult switch, but it was necessary.
Speaking of these chemical pesticides, where do you spray them?
Well, at first we only sprayed the pesticides outside, you know, on the vines themselves and the foundations of the building. But our pest problem was too bad. So we had to move to using the pesticide inside too. So we used it in the bottling area, in the wine cave, and sometimes I even thought about using them in the restrooms.
Just to clarify for the jury, did you spray pesticide in the same place that you store your wine at Peony Estates?
Yes, ma'am. You know, it was either spray or let the pesky things drink our wine, and it's paying customers only at Peony Estates.
All right, Mr. Lewis. Now, earlier you mentioned that you spray your vineyards. Are these vineyards where you grow your grapes?
Yes, ma'am. The vineyards are home to all our delicious grapes.
Now that we've established that pesticides are used at Peony Estates, I want to talk some more about how winemaking works at a vineyard. Mr. Lewis, if I showed you a depiction of a vineyard, would you be able to better explain how winemaking works at Peony Estates?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, permission to share a demonstrative?
Has the opposing counsel been shown this demonstrative?
Yes, Your Honor.
And is there any objections from the plaintiff?
No objections at this time, Your Honor.
Okay, then you may feel free to share your screen.
Now, Mr. Lewis, while we're waiting for the demonstrative to get shared, can you explain how grapes are distributed at the vineyard?
Sure thing. So at Peony Estates, we grow grapes on a sloped hill, kind of like this one. We've got some grapes at the top, and these are for our more expensive and fine wine. That's because they have better soil. But then we've got our grapes at the bottom, and they get too much water because they're at the bottom of the hill and they tend to be bigger. So we use those for our more affordable wines.
Now, Mr. Lewis, I know I keep talking about this, but you mentioned that you spray pesticide in the vineyard. How exactly does that work?
Well, we start by spraying the pesticide at the top. And you know, that pesticide runs down the hill in a kind of runoff towards the bottom grapes. And because we've got no drainage system at the bottom, those grapes can be exposed to a lot of pesticide when it pools. And so we've got to make sure to be extra careful with those grapes.
What do you mean you have to be careful with those grapes?
Well, ma'am, we make 2 tiers of wine at Peony Estates. We've got the grapes from the top and some with the grapes from the bottom. And the grapes at the bottom tend to have these grapes with too much pesticide in them. So I throw out 20% of our crop every year from these bottom grapes just to be safe.
Well, Mr. Lewis, now that we've established that there's 2 tiers of wine made at Peony Estates and we've established how the process usually goes, I want to talk specifically about 2019. How long does it take for wine to age at Peony Estates?
We age wine for 1 year.
So what wine was made using the 2018 harvest?
The 2018 harvest was used to make the 2019 Cara wine.
And when you were making the 2019 Cara wine, did you follow that process of throwing out 20% of those bottom grapes?
No, ma'am, not personally. I went home that weekend to celebrate my mama's birthday, and so I asked Harper Martini to toss the waterlogged grapes out while I was gone.
Do you know if Miss Martini followed your instructions?
No, ma'am, I don't. I sure hope she did, because the last time that I talked to Harper about throwing out grapes, she said that I throw out too many. So I'm just not sure if she did throw them out.
And Mr. Lewis, what happens to grapes at your winery that aren't thrown out?
Well, they're used in the production of our wine.
So if those 20% of grapes from the 2018 harvest were not thrown out, would they be present in the 2019 wine?
Yeah, they would.
Speculation.
Okay, elaborate.
I believe that the attorney is asking Austin Lewis to speculate on something that could have happened and not something necessarily that did happen, and is really just kind of going into more of things that the witness cannot necessarily know for certain. And I believe that that's out of the scope of what he can testify to.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. The witness has already established that grapes that aren't thrown out are used in that year's production of wine. This isn't speculation. We're not asking him to speculate about the grapes, because as head winemaker at Peony Estates, he knows what happens when grapes are not thrown out, like we've already established.
May I briefly respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
I do believe that opposing counsel was asking specifically in that year, 2019 Cara wine process, if those grapes were to be used into the making of the Cara wine. And I believe that that's specifically speculating about something that the witness does not know if it happened or not, since the witness has just testified that he was not there and he did not know if that happened or not.
Okay, so there's no need. So here's what I'm going to do, because I'm a little confused as well with the whole 2018. If he didn't oversee the 2018, how he can test the 2019. Let's wait to hear his answer, and then feel free to re-raise there if you think he's speculating or lacks foundation to say what he's saying. So for right now, the objection is overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Mr. Lewis, just to clarify for the jury, did you oversee the winemaking process for the 2019 Cara wine?
No, ma'am. Like I said, I was out of town that weekend, so I tasked Harper Martini with taking care of it.
And did you task Harper Martini with taking care of those 20% of grapes?
Yes, ma'am. I let her know which grapes to throw out specifically by roping them off, and I let her know that they needed to be discarded.
After that, though, were you still the head winemaker when you were creating the rest of the wine for the 2019 Cara wine production?
Yes, ma'am. I just happened to be out of town that one weekend.
So, Mr. Lewis, if the grapes used in the 2018 harvest weren't thrown out, would they be present in that 2019 Cara wine?
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation still. I do believe that the same circumstance when I lodged my objection previously is still present. I believe that if Harper Martini is testifying today, which I believe the defense is calling him, then Harper Martini can testify that, but I don't believe that Austin Lewis can testify if the grapes were actually thrown out or not, since he was not there that weekend when this fact and this event was occurring.
There's no need. I tend to disagree, counsel. I believe that opposing counsel has made it clear that this is more of a hypothetical scenario of if that happened. If you believe that she's stating it more as a fact or anything, feel free to re-raise it on cross. But I think that it's fine out here to get outside the room of speculation. So I'm going to overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Mr. Lewis, one more time. If the grapes used in the 2018 harvest weren't thrown out, would they be present in the 2019 Cara wine?
Yes, ma'am. Any grapes not thrown out would have been used in production. So the less expensive Cara wine could have been made with those bottom grapes if they weren't thrown out.
So, would it surprise you if the wine made from those bottom grapes is the same wine that Mr. Petrillo drank?
I mean, I know that he drank Cara wine, but I don't know if he drank the cheap wine or from the bottom grapes or from the top grapes. So I don't really know.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. No further questions.
Thank you. Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Hi, Mr. Lewis. I'm just going to ask you a few questions today. So you testified previously that pesticide was kept on the property of Peony Estates. Isn't that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And Harper Martini knew how to use this pesticide, correct?
Yes, she did.
And Ms. Martini knew where this pesticide was stored. Isn't that right?
That's right. I trained all our employees, so they knew all about pesticide.
In fact, Harper Martini had firsthand experience with pesticide poisoning. Isn't that right, Mr. Lewis?
I'm sorry?
Harper Martini had firsthand experience with...
Your Honor, to speculation. Opposing counsel is asking the witness to speculate about Miss Martini's knowledge.
Response.
If I may proffer, this is an event and an interaction that the witness has witnessed, and that a conversation that he has had with with Harper Martini. And if I can continue with my questioning, I do believe that the witness will remember that there was, if I may proffer once again, that there was a different employee that had been poisoned by pesticide, and Austin Lewis is aware of that. And so I was getting into those questions. And if the witness doesn't know, I believe that on cross-examination, he can just state if he doesn't know.
For both of those reasons, I'm going to overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. And I'll re-ask my question. Mr. Lewis, one of the employees at Peony Estates had been poisoned by pesticide. Isn't that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And so Harper Martini had firsthand experience with this poisoning. And isn't that correct?
Yes.
And she made this clear to you. Isn't that right?
Yeah, Harper told me about some incident where a glass of wine was left out, pesticides got in it, and an employee got really sick when they drank it.
And Harper even described to you the qualities of this poisoned wine. Isn't that right?
The qualities, ma'am?
Yes, let me describe that. You can't tell the wine is poisoned from just looking at it with your eyes. Isn't that right?
Yes, Harper did tell me that.
And that you can't tell that the wine is poisoned just from smelling it. Isn't that right?
Correct.
Let's talk a little bit more about what you mentioned on direct examination. So you said the expensive wine is at the top of the vineyard, correct?
That's correct. It's our more luxurious wine.
And the more affordable wine is at the bottom. Isn't that right?
Correct.
But you don't know where the grapes came from that Genesis Petrillo drank with the Cara wine. Isn't that right?
No, ma'am. It could have come from either the top or the bottom. I'm not sure which wine was given to her.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. And I'm just going to wrap up. You've been working for Harper Martini for 5 years now. Isn't that right?
Well, I've been working with Harper Martini for 5 years, yes.
Awesome. And you have 10% stake in Peony Estates. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And so if Harper Martini loses this case, you'll lose a lot of money. Isn't that right?
I mean, I'm confident that if we lost Peony Estates, I'd land on my feet elsewhere. I think any winery would be proud to have me.
Mr. Lewis, just to redirect you back to my question, that's a yes to my question, correct? That you'd lose a lot of money.
Yes, ma'am.
In fact, losing Peony Estates is the last thing that you want to happen. Isn't that right?
Yeah, like I said, it's my favorite place in the world, so I wouldn't like to lose it.
No further questions, Your Honor.
No redirect, Your Honor.
Okay, with that, Mr. Lewis, thank you for your testimony. You are excused today. And 1 second before we begin with the next witness. All right. Anything further from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Harper Martini to the stand.
Ms. Martini, a reminder that you have been previously sworn at this time. Before we begin, can I please have the crossing attorney turn on their screen? Perfect. With that, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Ms. Martini. Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hi, I'm Harper Martini.
Ms. Martini, I want to begin with the reason we're here today. You're being accused of poisoning Mr. Petrillo. Did you?
No. I love Casey so much, even though I didn't get along with Genesis. Genesis was important to my son. I would never do anything to hurt him.
Okay, Ms. Martini, I want to talk about your relationship with both of these individuals in turn. Starting with your son, Mr. Soda. What's your relationship like with Mr. Soda?
Well, me and Casey used to be super close. I'm a single mom, and I have been for all of Casey's life. So every holiday, vacation, birthday, it's just been me and him.
And when did Mr. Soto's fiance, Mr. Petrillo, come into your lives?
Well, when Casey was an undergrad, he used to bring over his friends to the winery for holidays all the time. He said it was because I was a cool mom, but I'm pretty sure it was just because I had a shed full of wine. But anyways, one day he brought Genesis with him. But I just knew that Genesis was trouble since the moment I saw him. You know, moms know these things.
So, Ms. Martini, what was your relationship like with Mr. Petrillo around the time of his death?
Well, like I said, I didn't really like him that much. I thought that Casey could do a lot better, but I tried to make amends. You know, he was important to Casey, and Casey's important to me.
And were you able to make amends when you tried?
You know, it felt impossible. I was trying to be civil and try and make Genesis feel included in our family events. But one night, Genesis gave me this drunk voicemail. And he told me that he was moving to France with Casey after the wedding, and that I would never see my son again or any grandchildren. And he even said I was going to die alone.
Ms. Martini, how did you react when Mr. Petrillo told you all these things?
Well, honestly, I was really scared for my son. I can't believe that his fiance would call me and tell me these things. And it just felt like so unlike Casey for him to drop out of grad school and move across the world without even telling me. So I knew that I had to do something.
What did you do?
I overreacted a little bit, but I felt that Casey's relationship with Genesis was unhealthy for him. So I decided to offer Genesis some money to leave Casey to see if it would even work.
Ms. Martini, how did that conversation go when you offered money?
It wasn't really much of a conversation. I just put a note in an envelope with some money and sent it to Genesis.
Ms. Martini, that note has been shown today in trial. Would you recognize it if I showed it to you?
I would.
You're under permission to put Exhibit 24, which has already been entered?
You may.
Give me a moment to pull that up, Ms. Martini. All right, Ms. Martini, is this a note you were referring to?
Yes, it is.
Is it a true and correct copy of that note?
It is.
So, Ms. Martini, can you explain what you wrote in this letter?
Yes, this note I sent with the money to Genesis, and I offered him the money to leave Casey.
And Ms. Martini, I expect this is going to be asked of you, so I want to go ahead and ask you first. What did you mean when you said, otherwise I will take you out of the picture the hard way?
Well, if Genesis wasn't going to leave Casey and take the money, then I was going to try and get him help. Genesis too frequently had too much to drink. And so I was going to try and get him help at a rehab facility.
Okay, Ms. Martini, so just to clarify, when you wrote take him out of the picture, did you mean you were going to poison him at his wedding rehearsal?
No, of course not. I just wanted to help him.
Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit more about your business. What's your role at Peony Estates?
I'm the owner, so I handle all of the engagements with guests, booking people to come cater or to organize events, things like that, more the business side.
Are you involved with the spraying of pesticide at all?
No, I'm not.
And were you here for the testimony of Mr. Lewis, your employee?
I was.
When he was describing that process at the vineyard, are you involved in that at all?
Not necessarily the harvesting or spraying of pesticides. I normally just taste the wine before we sell it.
Did you taste the wine that you ended up giving to Mr. Petrillo?
I tasted wine from the top of the hill. That was the blend that we were planning on selling because it was more expensive and we needed to gain a bigger profit.
So just to be very clear, Ms. Martini, which wine did you give to Mr. Petrillo?
Back in 2019, Peony Estates wasn't doing that well financially, so I was going to sell the more expensive tier to gain a bigger profit. I decided to give Genesis wine from the lower tier of the Cara blend.
So since you said you didn't taste that lower tier, did you have any way of knowing if that wine was poisoned when you gave it to Mr. Petrillo?
I trust my employees to make sure my wine's safe. I would never give anything to Genesis that I didn't think was safe, let alone anyone.
Ms. Martini, I understand that you trust your employees, but I just want to make this very clear for the jury. Since you didn't taste it, do you have any way of knowing if it was poisoned?
Not personally, but again, I trust my employees to make sure my wine's safe, or else I wouldn't sell it.
All right, Ms. Martini, I do want to address some more of the allegations that have been brought against you today in trial. Why did you burn the note that we showed earlier in your direct examination?
I didn't want Casey to find it. I didn't want to upset him.
And Ms. Martini, how did Mr. Petrillo react when you gave him that note?
Well, he took the money.
What was your impression when that happened?
Well, I thought that he was going to leave Casey because that was the agreement I wrote in my note.
So on June 7th, did you believe the wedding was taking place?
No, I thought he was going to leave that night.
Okay, so now that we've addressed your alleged motive, Ms. Martini, did you ever try to poison Mr. Petrillo?
No. I would never hurt Casey or Genesis or anyone. Would never do that.
No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Cross?
Yes. Miss Martini, you're the owner of Peony Estates Winery, correct?
Yes, I am.
This business is one of the most central things to your entire life. Is that correct?
Yes, it's very important to me.
And the only thing that would have mattered to you more would have been your child, Casey, right?
Yes.
And your wish was for Casey to take over Peony Estates one day, right?
Of course. It's, I think, every parent's dream for their kid to follow after them.
But the only problem with that dream was Genesis, right?
Yes, Genesis was discouraging Casey from participating with the winery.
So you two got off on a bad foot, right?
We did, yes.
And Genesis was a threat to your business, right?
In the sense that he would go around to customers and tell them weird things about our food, yeah.
Right, insulting things, right?
Yeah, he told them weird things about The food being astronaut food? I really don't know. Genesis had a very strange sense of humor to me.
But you thought that if Genesis stuck around any longer, there was no way that Casey would think highly enough of your business or even you to stick around and take it over, right?
Yeah, I was worried about Genesis' influence on Casey.
And you thought your relationship with Casey and your business would be better off if Genesis were somehow out of the picture, right?
Yes.
And you spoke of receiving a voicemail from Genesis in May, less than a month before the wedding, correct?
I did.
And matters between you two were much worse at this time, right?
Yes, that was when Genesis told me that I would never see my son again.
Your Honor, permission to screen share Exhibit 8, which has already been previously admitted.
You may.
Genesis told you that it's time for you to know that after the wedding, they were moving to France, correct?
Yes, he told me about France.
And Casey hadn't told you yet, right?
No.
And Genesis said Casey didn't want you to know, right?
Yes, that's what Genesis said.
And he also said that you would never see them again, right?
Yeah, he said I would never see my son again, Genesis again, any grandchildren they had. It was quite the voicemail.
And in response, you told Genesis that there was nothing you wouldn't do to protect your only child, right?
Of course.
And you were really worried that with Genesis around, your relationship with Casey or even any contact would not have much time left, right?
I mean, yes, Genesis told me that he was going to take them away and I'd never see him again.
So let's talk about the rehearsal dinner on June 7th. Genesis arrived late, right?
He did.
You both had been arguing, right?
Yes.
But even still, the rehearsal went on, correct?
It did, yes.
And the event was catered, right?
It was.
And you provided each guest with a bottle of your Horizon wine, right?
Yes.
But you provided Genesis with a different wine, correct?
I did.
And he was the only one to receive anything different, right?
Yes, Genesis was very particular about his wine, so I wanted to give him something he'd actually like.
So you had this bottle of Cara wine special just for Genesis, right?
Yes, he would often refuse to drink other wines that he didn't like, so in order to avoid making a scene, Casey. I mean, excuse me, I gave him Cara's wine.
Oh, sorry. You personally gifted this special wine to Genesis, right?
I did.
And I want to talk to you about later that night, morning. Austin Lewis called you around 2:30 a.m., right?
I don't know who called me, but I got a call from someone saying that Genesis was, or excuse me, that someone was in the hospital.
Right, but they didn't know who it was, right?
Yes.
However, you went straight to Genesis's room that night, correct?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure he was okay. He drank.
That's right. So
I was really worried for
found
him.
an empty bottle. My apologies. You found an empty bottle of Cara on the floor of Genesis's room, correct?
Yeah, he left the wine stain and everything.
The same bottle that you had previously gifted, right?
Yes.
You then decided to throw the bottle away, correct?
I did.
But not before ripping off the label, right?
Yes.
And you are aware that the doctors believe Genesis's death to be caused by pesticide poisoning, right?
I believe I know that to be Genesis' cause of death. Yes, I heard that today.
And you know that this pesticide is considered an isofenphos organophosphate.
I don't believe I know anything about isofenphos.
Well, you have knowledge that this particular pesticide is one that you use on your property, correct?
Yes, I know that we use a similar brand, yeah.
In fact, you frequently use this pesticide, correct?
I believe so, but you'd have to ask Austin Lewis. He knows more about that than me.
Well, you were previously aware that someone drinking poisoned wine from this particular pesticide wouldn't smell it, right?
Yes.
That they wouldn't see it, correct?
Okay.
And you are aware of the side effects of this pesticide being mixed into wine could be fatal, right?
Of course.
That consuming this pesticide could lead to death, correct?
Yes, it's a dangerous substance. You have to be careful.
And you were relieved, happy, in fact, that Genesis was no longer in your life, right?
Yeah, he was not the best influence on Casey, so I'm happy that that's no longer there.
No further questions.
All right, thank you. Any redirect for this witness?
No redirect, Your Honor. We just ask that Ms. Martini be excused.
Ms. Martini, you are excused. Thank you for your testimony today. Now, 1 second before we begin with the next witness. All right. Defense, any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. Defense calls Dr. Cannon to the stand.
Dr. Cannon, a reminder that you have been previously sworn at this time. And with that, you may proceed.
Good afternoon. Could you introduce yourself to the jury?
To Richard Cannon.
Dr. Cannon, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm an associate consultant for Gardner Consulting Incorporated, but that's not how I started my career as a medical professional. I was the chief toxicologist at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and I actually took a faculty position at the local med school here in Midlands, and then I became an associate consultant.
Where did you get your education to do that?
Well, I got my bachelor's from the Ohio State University, go Buckeyes, and I got my MD with an emphasis in toxicology from Harvard Med.
How are you related to today's case?
Well, I was hired to assess the results and report of the treating physician of Mr. Petrillo from the night before and morning of his wedding.
How do you go about assessing the results of the physician that treated Genesis Petrillo?
Well, typically, as it is in my work as a consultant, we rely mainly on documents. We don't get to see the patient specifically. So I got to review the doctor's report, and using my method of comparative analysis, I reviewed that report and noted whenever anything vital was missing from it. I made sure to go through all of the steps that that doctor was supposed to take, and I note any errors in my findings.
Is this method reliable?
I would say so. Very reliable. It's the gold standard in the field of medical consulting, and well, it's basically a peer review. You know, it's frequently used to test the strength of the scientific method and the results of the actual doctor themselves.
Did you reliably apply this comparative analysis method to the case today?
I did.
Did you have all the materials that you needed to come to your conclusions?
I did. Like I said, I got to review the report of the treating physician, as well as the results of the tests that they ran on the victim. Aside from that, I also got the affidavit of an eyewitness who brought the victim into the hospital.
So what were the results of the physician who treated Genesis Petrillo?
Well, that doctor concluded that Ms. Petrillo died from pesticide poisoning. I got to see that through the death certificate that they signed.
Would you recognize a copy of that death certificate if I showed it to you?
I would.
Your Honor, may we put up what's been previously published to the jury as Exhibit 11?
You may.
Dr. Cannon, what are you looking at here?
Well, that's the death certificate I was talking about, signed by the treating physician, as it says, Dr. Kwan.
Now, did you agree with Dr. Kwan's conclusions?
Well, I do agree that the victim most likely died from pesticide poisoning. But I do believe there are some gaps in the physician's conclusions that make my conclusion different.
Now, when you explained this to me earlier, you used a visual aid. Do you think that would help the jury now?
I do.
Your Honor, may we put up a copy of Dr. Cannon's visual aid?
Has the opposing counsel seen this?
Yes, Your Honor.
And any objections?
Not right now, Your Honor. If anything comes up, I'll let you know.
Feel free to publish.
Now, Dr. Cannon, what exactly are we looking at now?
Well, here is where I summarize what we know about the victim's death, at least what the treating physician concluded. They concluded that pesticide went into a bottle of wine and that the victim died from after consuming. But there are gaps in that evidence between those three visuals in that conclusion of how the victim died.
What was the first gap?
Well, that treating physician ran a test on the victim's blood, and that test showed that there was pesticide in the blood, but it didn't show how much.
Why exactly does this matter?
Well, there's pesticides in almost everything we eat, really. If you eat some unwashed fruit, you can have some in your system right now. But in a case, since we don't know whether this was a suspicious amount or just a minute amount, that's a big gap in this conclusion.
Was there a second gap?
Yes, another test that the physician ran, but this time it was on the bottle of wine, the Cara bottle. But this bottle was actually found in a trash can next to an open pesticide canister. So we don't know how much pesticide was actually in the bottle when the victim drank it, and how much pesticide might have gotten there from being in that trash can.
So, Dr. Cannon, what can you conclude about Mr. Genesis Petrio's cause of death?
Well, only that the victim was poisoned with pesticides, really. The treating physician's conclusions, they don't tell us how the poison entered her system.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Dr. Cannon, before we begin, I think we both are aware I'm not a doctor, so if I get anything wrong while I'm asking you, please just let me know. I'm just here so that the jury can hear the facts from you.
Will do.
So, Dr. Cannon, just to start off with, and so the jury is perfectly clear on this, you believe that the most likely cause of death for Petrio is pesticide poisoning.
That's right.
And you also believe that it is most likely that the pesticide in Petrio's body came from the wine he drank.
Yes, that it was present in the wine.
Dr. Cannon, you would agree that there is actually compelling evidence that the wine contained pesticide.
Yes, we know that the wine contained pesticide. We just can't come to the conclusion of how it got
there. No further questions, Your Honor. I pass the witness.
Okay. Any redirect?
No redirect. May Dr. Cannon step down?
He may.
At this time, Your Honor, the defense has no further witnesses. We ask for a brief recess before closing.
Yes. Does anyone know what time all loss is?
I believe we started at 10:28.
Ooh, okay.
I know it's 12:55 Central.
55?
Yes, according to me.
Perfect. Okay. So then are we okay with both sides taking, I want to say, 7 minutes?
That sounds fine to me, Your Honor.
Perfect. Same thing as last time. Let's turn your cameras on so we know we can, you're all back. Thank you.
And we're coming back at 12:20?
Correct.
All right, Your Honor.
All right, I see both closers are here. Before we get Mr. Dean, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, I am ready.
Perfect. All right, is both parties ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, plaintiff, you may begin when ready.
And Your Honor, before I begin, permission to publish a copy of Exhibit 4 to the jury?
You may.
Or, excuse me, Your Honor, 24 to the jury.
Yes, you may.
And it's already been admitted into evidence.
Yes.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may proceed.
May it please the court. Genesis, it has come to this. The wedding can't happen. I need you out of our lives. Leave Casey, and the enclosed $300,000 is yours. Otherwise, I'll take you out of the picture the hard way. Members of the jury, what I just read to you, what you've seen previously today in this trial, is a note written by the defendant to Genesis Petrillo. Members of the jury, it's clear from this note a few things. That the defendant is all out of time and all out of options. Because on June 7th of 2019, the defendant had run out of her options to get Genesis Petrillo out of her life. From the defendant's own words in this letter, the wedding couldn't happen. She needed Petrillo out of her life. And she tried a lot of things, members of the jury. You heard about those attempts. The defendant tried to convince her son to break up with his fiancée. The defendant tried to cancel the wedding before it happened. The defendant threatened Petrillo in this very note, I'll take you out of the picture the hard way. And finally, when the defendant's last attempt to get rid of this person she hated so much failed, when her bribe didn't work, when Petrillo threw this letter back in her face, as you heard with the defendant's statements, she was all out of options. She was all out of time. Now, members of the jury, today we as the plaintiff had a burden. We had a burden of proving to you a few different elements. First, we had to prove to you an act, that the defendant put pesticide in a bottle of wine and gave that bottle to Genesis Petrillo. Second, intent, that the defendant intentionally put pesticide in that wine with the intent of causing harm. And third, that harm occurred, that Genesis Petrillo was poisoned by that wine. And members of the jury, we had to prove each of these things to you by a burden. Now, as my co-counsel at the beginning of this trial told you, this isn't a murder case. We're not here because of a crime that was committed. We're here for battery. And because of that, the plaintiff's burden is lower. Today, members of the jury, we didn't have to convince you beyond any doubt what happened to Genesis Petrillo, or beyond a reasonable doubt. Today, our burden was to show you these facts to be more likely than not. And that at the end of this trial, if you believe all of these things happened to Genesis Petrillo, that the defendant did each of these elements, you believe this to be greater than just 50% likely, then you'll have to find the defendant liable. And today, members of the jury, the plaintiff met this burden. And I want to go through with you exactly how we met this burden. First, the act. You heard today from Lonnie Paris, who was in Peony Estates in the winery on that day. She saw the defendant remove the bottle of Cara wine from the wine bottling area, sitting next to a nearly empty canister of pesticide. And you saw the results, the tests of that pesticide canister. They matched exactly with the pesticide that was in Genesis Petrillo's body, exactly with the pesticide that was found in that very bottle of wine. Members of the jury, you also heard from Angel Rodriguez. She told you some very important things. And Miss Rodriguez told you she saw the defendant walk into that kitchen holding a canister of pesticide. Members of the jury, when the defendant went in that kitchen right before the wedding rehearsal, she put that pesticide in the wine. And members of the jury, we showed you the intent. We showed you that note, that letter from the defendant to Genesis Petrillo. How the defendant was all out of time, out of options, that she needed Petrillo out of her life. Finally, members of the jury, we showed you that the pesticide is the cause of Petrillo's death. And you heard from Dr. Cannon, who took the stand today. And Dr. Cannon told you that there was compelling evidence that the pesticide came from the wine Petrillo drank, and that it was most likely the cause of his death. Members of the jury, when you go back into that room, I want you to remember the defendant was all out of time and all out of options. Find the defendant liable for battery.
All right, thank you. Defense. You may proceed.
May it please the court? Not every story has a villain. The plaintiff just told you a great story. Now I have to say, it sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? I will give the plaintiff some credit. They did swap out an evil stepmother with an evil mother-in-law, and a poisoned apple with a poisoned bottle of wine. But other than that, members of the jury, the plaintiff's story sounds just like fairy tales we heard when we were children. We all know that fairy tales and reality are two different things. So what is reality in today's case? The reality is that Harper Martini was a hard-working, loving mother who built a winery from the ground up while raising her daughter as a single mother. The reality is that Harper Martini didn't get along with her daughter's fiance because she was protective of Casey. She wanted Casey to finish college and marry someone who treated him right. The reality is that Harper Martini was a mother, not a murderer. On June 7th of 2019, Genesis Petrillo drank a bottle of contaminated wine. He died. How does a terrible, tragic accident like that happen? Well, today the head winemaker at Peony Estates told you about their winemaking process. How Peony Estates grows their grapes on a hill, how they spray chemical pesticides on their grapes, and how those pesticides can run off to the bottom of the hill, where they pool at the grapes at the bottom. The head winemaker told you that they often throw out the grapes at the bottom of the hill. Then he told you that in 2018, that didn't happen. In 2018, those grapes were mistakenly used to create the Cara bottle of wine, the same wine that Genesis Petrillo drank the night that he died. An oversight, an accident. That's reality. Now, the plaintiff has taken that reality and twisted it into a fairy tale, created a villain out of Harper Martini to fit their story. But if the plaintiff wants to sell you this story, if they want you to walk out of the courtroom today and find Harper Martini liable for the death of another human being, they have to do more than a couple bad quotes and a poor relationship. They have to prove three things to you. One, that Harper Martini put pesticides in the wine that Genesis Petrillo drank. Two, that Harper Martini intentionally put pesticides in that wine, knowing that Genesis Petrillo would be harmed. And three, that as a result of that intentional action, Genesis Petrillo died. They have to prove every single one of those elements to you by preponderance of the evidence. And that burden rests only with the plaintiff. Never does it fall on the defense. And that means that the plaintiff, their story has to be more likely than all other alternatives combined. What do they bring you to satisfy that burden? Did they bring you security footage of Harper Martini poisoning that wine bottle? Did they bring you eyewitness testimony of the incident? Did they bring you forensic evidence of Harper Martini's fingerprints on the wine bottle or on the pesticides? No. They didn't bring that to you because they don't have that evidence. It never happened. Members of the jury, take a step back and think about what the plaintiff is asking you to believe. But on the night of a wedding rehearsal, when guests are arriving, family members are arriving, people are preparing food, drinks, getting plates, Harper Martini takes a wine bottle, walks into the kitchen, uncorks the bottle, pours some wine out, pours some pesticides back in, recorks the wine bottle, and then in the middle of a toast, in front of everyone, she takes that murder weapon and she walks over to Genesis Petrillo and hands it to him for everyone to see. That's the plaintiff's story. But let's not forget that not a single person testified today that they saw Harper Martini poison that wine bottle, because it never happened. The plaintiff just made it up. And as the plaintiff was going through their evidence and writing their story, they realized that they didn't have enough evidence. So they decided to make some more things up. They came up with a quote. Pesticides are for Genesis because Genesis is such a pest. In the plaintiff's story, Harper Martini comes up with this master plan to kill Genesis Petrillo, and instead of just keeping it to herself, she goes to the best friend of the person that she's about to kill and tells them, I'm going to kill Genesis. Like a cartoon villain. Then the plaintiff brought you an investigative journalist, who the plaintiff is trying to imply found the pesticide canister, which was the source of the poison in the wine bottle. Now that investigative journalist got up on direct and said that she found that canister at Peony Estates. But we looked at that report today, members of the jury. That report says that that pesticide canister was in her shed. And when I asked her about it on cross, she agreed it was in her shed. And then she realized what she said. So she backtracked. She said, wait, I was lying. That wasn't in my shed, that was at Peony Estates. Because she knew what it would do to her story. And let's not forget that that's the only reason she's here in court today, a story. A story that she's gonna publish to advance her own career. Members of the jury, we brought you an expert today, but the plaintiff didn't. They're trying to convince you that Genesis Petrillo died from pesticide poisoning, and they failed to bring you the person who treated them. The person who treated Genesis Petrillo the night that he died, who can confirm that Genesis Petrillo died from pesticide poisoning. All they brought you was a sheet of paper, a death certificate. Now, we did bring you an expert. Our expert told you that the scientific evidence doesn't tell us if this was accidental or intentional. The scientific evidence points both ways. And members of the jury, we sympathize with Mr. Petrillo's family. What happened to him was a tragedy. But not every story has a villain. Don't let the plaintiff take this tragedy and tear a family apart because of it. Find Harper Martini not liable. Thank you.
Thank you. Plaintiff, do you have a rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, you may proceed.
proceed.
You may. Do we know how much time we have left?
1 minute and 2 seconds.
Okay, 1 minute, 2 seconds. I'll hold you to that. So you may proceed when ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Members of the jury, the defense just told you that we didn't bring you any video footage or any fingerprints. And that's true. But members of the jury, that's not our job. It's not our responsibility to prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt 100% that the defendant is liable today. Our responsibility in this case was to prove to you that the defendant intentionally poisoned Genesis Petrillo by a preponderance of the evidence. And that means at the end of this trial, you believe that it's more likely than not, greater than 50% chance likely the defendant did this, then you have to find her liable. Members of the jury, remember the note the defendant wrote. The defendant is all out of time and all out of options. Find the defendant liable for battery.
Thank you. All right. Great job, everybody. Great round. If everyone could please, all the competitors, please turn their cameras on so that Mr. Dean and I can see all the names and everything while we're filling out our ballots here. I will turn off my camera and mute that gives the illusion as if I'm leaving the room, which would normally happen here. And we'll finish the ballot, and then I will. We can both turn on our cameras on when we're done, and we will do comments after that. All right. Thank you all. All right, I have submitted. Mr. Genie submitted. Perfect. Well, okay, you've heard way too much from me this round, so I will let Chandler go and introduce himself and give comments for you all, and then I will follow up.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Chandler. I am a 3L at Baylor Law School. I thought overall this was probably the best round I've seen the entire competition. So props to you all for that. with that in mind, there's usually an inverse relationship between my comments and the quality of the round. So that means I'll probably be more critical with you all just because I thought the round was so much higher than others I'd seen, especially because we've reached the end. And so this will be for moving forward rather than substantive for the rest of the competition. I wasn't a big fan of either team's themes. And let me tell you why. Themes need to be something that the jury can immediately get behind and that you can build the theory of your case on top of, right? So you want to look for something that's a universal truth, essentially, that when you say it, the jury can immediately say, oh yeah, I agree with that. If that's what this case is about, then I'm definitely going to find for this side, right? So for example, if you start with a quote from the case, like I'm afraid Harper is going to kill me, or if you start with not every story has a villain, the problem with going for something that's catchy without something that the jury can immediately agree with is it can be flipped and it can be used against you, right? So for example, if you say something that, I'll use an example from a competition I just did. It was a murder case and the defendant was claiming insanity. And so they said their theme was overpowered, overcome, overlooked, right? And they were talking about the defendant and his claimed insanity defense. Well, as the prosecution, when we were going against the people that used that theme, he had killed his 5-year-old son. And so we could flip that in closing arguments and say the real person who was overpowered was the 5-year-old who was strangled by the person who was supposed to protect him. Things like that, right? So sometimes you need to sacrifice catchiness, alliterative things for the sake of making sure the jury can agree with what you're saying, right? And then that builds the theme of your case because you want the theory of your case and the theme of your case to match up. And I think that was sometimes a disconnect here. For example, with the villain thing, I think it can work, but what you want to make sure is that your theory also matches up. Because if you just say, oh, this person was careless, well, the jury's going to think, well, then aren't they still a villain? Especially if she was trying to break up their relationship. That seems something that's kind of villainous, right? So just be intentional with your themes and make sure it's something that the jury can get behind. I thought both sides, though, did a good job of telling their story in their openings, especially, but throughout the entirety of the trial. Make sure whenever you're telling the story, you start with the bad guy first, as a rule of thumb. That, again, and I will throw in the caveat that not everybody's going to agree with all of this stuff. This is just what, from my experience and from what I've seen work, seems to be best practice. So I always think you want to try and start with the bad guy first and then bring in your client, things like that. Don't ask the witnesses why they're there today. Because best case scenario, the jury kind of rolls their eyes because they know that you brought the witness there. Worst case scenario, it's a witness who's been subpoenaed and they say, well, I'm here because you made me be here, right? So I would just start telling your story through the witnesses. Along with that, it's okay to talk like a normal person. I think legally, people are starting to get away from the idea that because things have always been done this way, they ought to continue being done that way. So there's really no need. I've been telling people throughout this competition, I'm going to end the phrase, may I be heard, within the next 2 years. There's no reason to say it. You can wait for the judge to either ask, or you can just say, Judge, can I respond to that? Because especially going forward, if any of you are thinking about going into law practice at some point too, if you're there with a jury of lay people, they're going to be like, why are they talking like that? You want to become relatable, right? So don't say things like, may I be heard? Don't remember, it's not your case, it's your client's case. So don't ask, may my witness step down? Or I want to talk about this when you're signposting, because it's not about you, right? You're talking, you're basically like a talk show host who's got the guests there and then the audience, and you're just facilitating the conversation between the witness and the jury. So make sure you kind of take yourself out of it a little bit. One thing I noticed, I was really glad that in this round, people used demonstratives, because that's been wholly lacking throughout this entire competition. It was very smart and really well done. Make sure when you're using demonstratives, though, you are checking with the witness that what you're putting on the demonstratives accurately summarizes what their testimony is, because either you're going to draw an objection. For example, I think at one point somebody said that they got engaged in 2012, but then the demonstrative said that they met in 2012, and that probably should have drawn an objection because that would have been an inaccurate summarization and frankly a leading objection, because then you're leading the witness in what was actually the correct answer. So make sure when you're putting something up there, you're A, clarifying you're correctly summarizing it. B, the other reason you do it is because you need it in the record, because demonstratives don't go back with the jury as exhibits. They can't take demonstratives back into the deliberation room. So you need those things to be a part of the record. So just in terms of practice, be sure to say what's going on there. Watch speaking objections. There was a little too much of speaking objections. And if you don't know, speaking objections are where you say objection, hearsay, or whatever, and then you launch into this long diatribe about what the issue is. As long as you've made your objection clear, if the judge needs clarification, the judge will ask. And so you don't want to do speaking objections, because again, remember, juries hear speaking objections and it just kind of looks a little bit, too TV, and you don't want to hurt your credibility. Let's see, anything else? Just this popped up just to clarify the issue. 804, imminent death. It's not that they are worried, it's that they actually believe and reasonably believe they're about to die. So it can't just be a mere worry. On cross-examination, this is where most of my notes come from for every round. Cross-examination is the best place to tell your story. And so you want to structure your cross-examination in that way. And the best example I can give is don't start out up front accusing the witness of lying or something on direct, right? It doesn't look good. And you want the jury to feel like they're discovering things themselves, right? You want to give them the tools to discover things. So instead of saying you were lying earlier, you can say, you came here today understanding that you would be asked to tell the truth, right? And you know that the jury is relying on your testimony today. And so you need to give them a consistent story, and you need to give them all of the information that you know, right? But that's not what happened today, is that? That's not what happened today, correct? Because on direct, you said this. But earlier, isn't it true, Mr. or Mrs. Witness, that you said this? Or isn't it true that this is also the case? You want to kind of wordsmith so you don't come out and say you're lying, because that looks too aggressive. You want the jury to feel like they're discovering things. Same with expert witnesses when you're talking about bias or something. You can say something like, you understand it's your job to give your objective and unbiased opinion as an expert witness. And the jury's relying on that. And if there was anything that could undermine your objectivity, the jury has a right to know. But you didn't tell them about something that does undercut your objectivity, right, Mr. Witness? You didn't tell them that you're a consultant for this big firm, right? Something like that. So they arrive at the conclusion themselves, and you don't harm your credibility by attacking the witness. I think that's pretty much the big things I have. Be intentional with your word choices. I know this is more because of who's available to be a witness in mock trial, but make sure you're being correct when you're using pronouns and referring to the witness. I know it can change from round to round, but make sure that that's something that you do. Make sure that when you're woodshedding your witness, which if you don't know woodshedding, working with your witnesses, make sure they understand the things that could undercut their own testimony. So every round where there's been an expert, I've heard the expert say, I was hired to. That immediately destroys some credibility. You want to woodshed your witness to say, I was asked to do this. And then if it comes up on cross, well, very easily on redirect, you can say, why do you charge for this? And they can say, well, because my time is valuable. It's not my main job. I have other things. So it's very easy to come back from that. So make sure you work with your witnesses on what to say. Same thing with saying, we don't know what was going on because the victim so-and-so. Well, if you're the defense, if they say the person's the victim, that seems almost like an admission, right? So that would be my last thing, is be very intentional and very careful with your word choices, and when working with your witnesses on word choices, and as witnesses with your word choices, because without knowing it, you can give subtle signals to juries, judges that, oh, I don't actually fully believe this, even though that's not the case.
Thank you. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Christopher Royce. I'm a 2L at Baylor Law. This is actually, I think, the first time I've seen majority of you. But again, I thought it was a really good job. I'm going to keep my comments to kind of just same thing as Chandler, just general things for everyone. My specific comments are in the comment sheet that I submitted. But the whole theme of all my comments are going to be just about adjusting to the round, adjusting to the rules that AMPTA have changed this year. So the first one is adjusting to the judge that's in the round. So I know I kind of threw people off with the whole exhibits and how that works. Just you got to be able to adjust. And when I ask at the very beginning if there's any clarifying questions, and I think Mr. Pineda, you did that. You asked a clarifying question. Good, but I'm expecting you to ask me then, because when it goes to the round, I want it smooth. I don't want any of those mess ups. So just make sure you know what's going on there. And I know you may have practiced it one way, but that's one thing you want to do. But again, another example of the judge is when objection responses. There's some times where I gave some like explanations as to why I ruled a certain way, and then you all would use that at a later time. I think both sides did that. That was really good. And I think even just not even objections, but just overall listening to the judge, Miss Singh, you think you had the best example when there was a speculation objection, and I kind of said, I'm a little bit confused as well. And you then went back and made it very clear that this is a hypothetical scenario. We're not saying it as fact. And I thought that was perfect. Perfect example of exactly what you want to do there. So good job on that. But I think there were some times where I think with some objections or some other things, you could have used things that I said in the past more often than you did. So not saying you don't know how to do that, but just make sure you pay attention the whole round. My second and third points are kind of combined. It's time and cross. I'm typically pretty hard on cross when it comes to scoring for attorneys and witnesses, because I think witnesses, you have a hard line that you have to be able to meet, right? You don't want to be too argumentative, but you want to stay in that character that you did while also making sure you're not ruining your team's case theory, right? And so I'm just, one thing I think with that, most of the witnesses I think here did a very good job, but when you're defeated or when you think that you lost a point, don't show it on your face. There were many times in this round where a cross point or the attorney would get something out of the witness and the witness would get really mad. Or I could see on the witness's face that they remembered, oh, this statement was actually in my affidavit. I think the best example of that was my Rodriguez. When you played kind of like a not a smart witness, right? And I think they hit you on one point about, oh, you don't know, you actually said this, right? And you then changed your mind, which is fine, but play up that with your character, like, oh yeah, like I guess that's what I said, right? But like the way that I saw it in your face, I could, okay, no, I know it was in our affidavit and he's getting to that, right? Don't show the defeat, because then for me, it shows me that the attorney won that point, and that's not what you want. But there was examples of that overall, not just trying to call you out. You did a very good job. And then time, I know AMPTA really messed up with this time this year. But the two things with that is I don't want to see any rushing. And I think there was kind of rushing on both of the last witnesses. Cannon, I'll get to you in a second, but I think that might have been for different reasons. But on the plaintiff side, I think there was a lot of rushing when it came to the end. And so just watch that. I would rather you cut things in the middle and do your presentation still slowly and have a good performance than rush through your points to make sure you meet the time, because then the jury is not going to be able to follow it. And so then that brings me to my final point, and that's canon. So this is the first round that I've seen where canon's called where Quan wasn't. And I think I know it's hard because you already have to deal with all the contingencies of this witness or that witness, but I think you do need to have a whole almost separate direct and cross for both sides of if Quan isn't called. And I think the direct was still good in terms of I understood how with your case theory, but I still think I felt like there was a lot missing because you were trying to, you normally would attack a Quan if they were called in round. So I think that you got to do some of that extrapolation, right, that we see in mock trial all the time. Take a few lines and kind of make that a bigger deal. And really, when it comes down to cross and direct with time, I think there was a thing with this with Miss Worth and Paris, I think. There wasn't a lot in that cross, like substantively, and I wanted you to fill it up a little bit more about what we don't know, what we do know, right? And y'all did a good job of that, but I wanted just a little bit more of that to fill, not necessarily, I don't want to say fill your time, but just to add some more substance to that cross and tell us what they can't tell us, okay? But yeah, so canon, that's just one thing a piece of advice I would have going forward. Have a contingency plan, because I thought it was good, but I thought it was very misplaced without a quant. And I think you need to be able to say, oh, we're calling canon for this reason, and it's not just to attack quant's conclusions. But yeah, overall, very good job. I agree with Chandler. I think this is one of the best runs I've seen. So good job. Best of luck to you all as you prepare for regionals and your next tournaments. And yeah, and we'll stay on for like a minute or so if you have any questions for us. But other than that, good job, y'all, and best of luck.
Thank you
Thank you all for judging.
Yeah,
Do
thank
you
you.
guys want to know our schools?
Yes.
We're UT Austin.
And we're Texas A&M.
Yes, I am friends with both Bridget Meyer and Tanner Sheaf, who work with you. So good job. Yes. Very good job, guys. Again, best of luck.
Thank you so much for judging.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for giving us your time. We appreciate it, and your comments, very helpful. Thank you.
Go.
To the other team. Good luck.
As well, thanks.